Welcome back to another episode of Junkyard Wanderings. My name is Joel. Let's take a look at whatever oddities we have in store for today. The car we are looking at today is kind of a plain one, and here we go. We're looking at this car because I think it is an interesting version of an extremely common car. This is a 1995 Saturn SW1. Now, before we get into the details on this car, when you take a look at it, size it up. It's shorter than a Volvo 240 wagon. It is longer than a Mazda Protege 5. I want you to think how much you think this car weighs. I'll give you a minute. Play that Jeopardy music. This car weighs about 2,450 pounds. That's insane to me. I mean, just the two cars I gave you just now, the Volvo 240 wagon is about 2,900 pounds. That Mazda Protege 5, about 2,700 pounds. This thing was light. It might actually weigh less than that since this is the single overhead cam engine and not the double overhead cam engine version. But I'm sure the plastic body panels had something to do with that. Metal hood. Yep. And I'm sure the aluminum engine construction had something to do with it as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of this car, how it came to be, and where it kind of fits in the 1990s.
One of the things I love about the early Saturn car lineup is it's like playing the first level of a video game where you're basically doing a car manufacturer simulator. So they had three car models. They had a coupe, the SC, they had the sedan, the SL, and then they had a wagon, the SW. So I think SW would be Saturn wagon. That makes sense. I think SC would be Saturn coupe. I have heard that SL means sedan line or Saturn line. I don't know if anybody really knows. There's two engines available. There's a single overhead cam and a double overhead cam. The higher the number, the higher the trim level. Anything that ends in 2 gives you the double overhead cam. It's just hilariously simple. The S-Series came out as a 1991 model, and the wagon was released in 93. These wagons were not very common. They were outsold by the sedans by a ratio of 11-to-1. So obviously the wagon, way less popular than the sedan. That's not really that surprising. You know, this is 1995. The wagon body style is already been in decline for years. You know, the minivan and now the SUV are starting to reign. So no big surprise there. The Saturn car company had been in the works since the mid-'80s, and GM came up with the idea for this company basically because they're getting crushed by the imports. You know, they're getting beaten in the small, efficient car department by Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Mazda, plenty of others. And they basically said, we think we can do this, and we think we can compete in this market. So Saturn, was an idea for a line of small, efficient, compact cars. And of course, this is in the mid-'80s. There's prototypes coming out, things like that. You can look up pictures online. It's all out there. And, you know, this is also happening around the same time that GM is going to go through this new partnership with Toyota. And this is a whole nother story for, a whole nother time. But the short version is GM and Toyota started working together on a project called NUMMI. Basically, Toyota had a chance to get a foothold in manufacturing in America, and in exchange, they taught GM how they make cars. And GM sent employees over to Japan, and they learned about all the major differences between manufacturing culture, between Toyota and GM. And there were all these lessons learned, and basically GM decided to take what they had learned and implement it at their new star child, which is Saturn. So these two things are happening at the same time, and they sort of come together to help make Saturn into this special, different car company that can do things a little bit differently and not the same old GM way. They really were known in the 90s as this like special company. Their original advertising was literally a different kind of car company. And that was their first advertising tagline. So the plastic body panels was one of the things that really made them different. That's probably the thing that people remember the most about early Saturn. They had all these commercials where, you know, they're hitting things with the cars and the panels aren't denting, they're popping back into place. And, you know, it wasn't all the panels. It wasn't the roof or the trunk or the hood, but it was a big deal at the time because it was so different, and a lot of people kind of had this aha moment where they were thinking, yeah, why didn't we do this before, you know? They were also known for no haggle pricing. Basically, the price that was shown on the car at the dealership was the price you paid. Dealers didn't negotiate. People felt like it kind of helped ease some of the anxiety and the stress of buying a car. And that was a big change to do that for new cars, no haggle pricing. And their cars didn't share a platform with anything else that GM made. There was no parts bin sharing. There was no, you know, this is the engine from the Chevy Cavalier. They had their own engines. They had their own chassis. They had their own body panels. It was all different. And that was really pretty special at the time. They also kind of went high-tech in some ways. I'm kind of like using quotes around that. By high-tech, I mean, in particular, besides the body panels, they were using aluminum engine blocks and aluminum cylinder heads. And that was kind of a big deal for 1991. Customers, you know, often raved about the experience of Saturn dealerships. They met many members of the service team whenever they bought their cars. They would, you know, be applauded by employees when they'd buy a car. They'd have their picture taken and put up on a bulletin board. They just did all these little things that they tried to make selling a car and getting it serviced different than what people were used to. And their customer satisfaction was like through the roof back then. I mean, people loved Saturn. I mean, people loved buying a Saturn. They loved owning a Saturn. And it was just kind of a special time for that company. So just to get back to the specifics for this car, you know, originally, the funny thing is they had aluminum engines, engine blocks and cylinder heads. But for some reason, Saturn used throttle body injection for their first engine. So yeah, that's one big fuel injector spraying fuel for all four cylinders, which is absurd today. But in the late 80s, it was still kind of common. It's sort of a stopgap between carburetors and multi-port fuel injection. I always thought that was wild that Saturn bothered to release an engine like that when they were trying to go with efficiency and high tech. That engine made less than 100 horsepower. That engine was later updated in the mid-90s, I think actually this year, 95, when they added multi-port fuel injection, and that got them right up to about 100 horsepower. Now, the twin-cam engine made a little more power. It was in the 120-something, 124, 125 horsepower range. And, you know, for my money, I would love to find one of these Saturns in the wagon shape with the twin cam and the 5-speed manual. I think that would be really cool. To me, this is a special car that represents a special time. This company was full of hope. It was optimism. It was something different. It was refreshing. But as usual with GM, it didn't last. They weren't able to keep the special production techniques that they learned from Japan. They weren't able to keep the positive sales experience. They were not able to keep the individuality of Saturn going. They started redesigning their cars first in the mid to late 90s, and then again in the early 2000s. Those early 2000s cars, they never really capitalized on the popularity of the early cars. They started sharing platforms and engines with other vehicles that GM sold. They started to lose their independence from other GM divisions, and that whole like different kind of car company thing, it just wore off. The customer satisfaction went down. They just by the early to mid 2000s, they weren't special anymore. It's just wild how that arc started in 91, and then just like 12 or 13 or 14 years later, it was gone. Like the magic was gone. Saturn, of course, ended up closing its doors somewhere in the time frame of the 2008 recession. Saturn was a casualty. I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs, but that was really the timing. I didn't look up any exact numbers, but it's less than 20 years this car company existed. This represents a time when a company was doing something that nobody else was doing, and I think for that reason alone, it's a pretty special car. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. Thanks so much for watching Junkyard Wanderings, and hopefully we'll bring you some more fun cars soon. Cheerio.